Guess I just voided the warranty on a warplane. Who the hell touched my plane? The voice sliced through the freezing air of the English airfield like a gunshot. It was December, 1943. Snow fell in lazy spirals around the hulking form of a battered P-47 Thunderbolt, its metal skin still steaming from the heat of its last run over France. The pilot, Lieutenant Jack Ringo Harrison, stormed across the tarmac, his flight jacket flapping in the wind. The mechanics froze. Near the tail, a grease-covered figure didn't even look up from his wrench. "That'd be me," said Sergeant Frank Opie O'Malley. "She needed a little persuasion to stay in the sky." Ringo stared, eyes wide. "Persuasion? You cut open the damn engine cowling." O'Malley shrugged, wiping his hands on a rag. "Manuel said she was overheating." "I fixed the overheating." The pilot's voice rose. "You can't just carve into a government aircraft." O'Malley's calm reply stopped everyone cold. "Guess I just voided the warranty on a warplane." For a heartbeat, silence. Then someone laughed. But the joke didn't stick. Everyone knew what that meant. O'Malley had broken Army Air Force regulations, plain and simple. What he had done wasn't just risky, it was illegal. The P-47 had a reputation. A flying tank. Big, slow, stubborn, and prone to burning up if pushed too hard. Pilots hated it. Mechanics cursed it. But O'Malley saw something else. A sleeping monster waiting to be unleashed. He'd spent his youth under the Oklahoma sun, fixing tractors and pickup trucks, machines that rattled and coughed, but always got the job done. To him, the Thunderbolt wasn't a failure. It was a challenge. "The Army calls her a fighter," he once told a buddy. "But I say she's a hammer. You just have to swing her right." The official solution from headquarters was simple. Stop flying missions until new parts arrived from the States. O'Malley looked at the supply log and laughed bitterly. 3 weeks for new ducting," he muttered. "That's 3 weeks of men dying." That night, after the last engine shut down and the floodlights dimmed, O'Malley stayed behind. The hangar smelled of oil and burnt metal. He climbed the maintenance ladder, flashlight between his teeth, and started cutting into the Thunderbolt's intake system. Every spark was a potential court-martial. Every clang of his wrench echoed like a gunshot in the empty night. He didn't care. He wasn't chasing glory. He was trying to keep his friends alive. Hours passed. When the sun came up, the mechanics found him still at work. Eyes red, hands raw. He'd reshaped the cowling with his own tools, rerouted the air ducts, and welded a makeshift baffle from scrap aluminum stripped off a wrecked Spitfire. It looked ugly, like someone had grafted farm equipment onto a fighter plane. But the airflow numbers didn't lie. When he hit the starter, the engine roared, not the choking growl everyone was used to, but a clean, hungry sound. The needle stayed cool. No overheating, no smoke. O'Malley leaned back against the fuselage, exhausted, but smiling. "You're not a jug," he said softly, patting the metal. "You're a bull." The next morning, Ringo Harrison flew that very plane over the channel. What happened next would make the P-47 Thunderbolt a legend and turned Frank O'Malley into the most dangerous kind of mechanic, the one who didn't need permission to save the world. Before O'Malley's illegal fix, the P-47 Thunderbolt was the joke of every briefing tent in England. Pilots called it the Jug, short for Juggernaut, or as most said, a flying milk jug. It was big, heavy and sluggish at low altitude. It couldn't climb fast enough to catch a Messerschmitt, and it couldn't turn sharp enough to dogfight a Focke-Wulf. To the men risking their lives every day, the P-47 felt less like a fighter plane and more like a bad bet. "Every time I take her up," one pilot muttered, "I feel like I'm riding a safe with wings." Even the Germans laughed. Luftwaffe intelligence reports mocked it as an aircraft better suited for hauling milk than for combat. The sleek Bf-109 seconds and FW-190 seconds of the Reich could dive, turn, and climb with elegance. The Thunderbolt just muscled through the sky like a drunken brawler, loud, brute, and inefficient. But to Frank O'Malley, that muscle was everything. He'd grown up in the Dust Bowl where nothing ever worked the way it was supposed to. The tractors broke down daily. The wind howled through cracks in the house. When the Depression hit, his father lost the farm. But Frank never lost the habit of fixing what others threw away. "If it moves, it can fight," he used to say. So when he was drafted into the Army Air Forces, he didn't see the P-47's flaws. He saw potential. An engine so powerful it could lift an elephant, wings that could take hits from cannons and keep flying, and a body built like a steel anvil. He just needed to make the airflow match the horsepower. Still, every day he had to listen to the same complaints. Pilots called the P-47 a death sentence. Mechanics grumbled that even routine maintenance required 2 men and a prayer. And headquarters, bogged down in red tape, sent out endless memos about strict adherence to design parameters. O'Malley ignored most of them. He'd read enough technical manuals to know what the engineers thought the plane could do. But he also watched men die because those same engineers weren't the ones fighting gravity at 20,000 feet. The regulation said don't touch the intake ducts. O'Malley's gut said the ducts were choking the engine like a noose. That clash between the rulebook and the reality defined life on that airfield. At the 56th Fighter Group under the command of Colonel Hubert Hub Zemp, every pilot and crewman felt the pressure. They were supposed to stop the Luftwaffe from tearing Allied bombers apart, but their aircraft kept failing them. By the time the replacement parts arrived, another mission would be gone, and another pilot might never come back. One morning, after retrieving a shot-up Thunderbolt that barely limped home, O'Malley found the ground crew staring at the melted engine cowling. The heat had warped the panels and blown out the turbocharger seals. She wasn't flying, one mechanic said quietly. She was dying in the air. O'Malley didn't respond. He just ran his hand along the scorched metal. He could feel where the airflow had failed. He knew exactly where to start. That night, as the squadron slept, he began sketching his plan in grease pencil on the hangar wall: widened ducts, redirected flow, and a custom baffle shaped from scavenged Spitfire parts. The idea was simple: feed the beast more air, and it'll live longer. To most, it was crazy. To him, it was logic. "The jug's not a joke," he said to himself, marking the diagram with one last line. "It's a hammer. All it needs is a better handle." And that's when Frank O'Malley decided to do the one thing every mechanic knew not to do: break the rules of war and the laws of engineering. Before Frank O'Malley became the man who rewrote the Thunderbolt's destiny, he was just another grease monkey from the flatlands of Oklahoma. Born in 1915, he grew up during the Dust Bowl, a world where machines mattered more than dreams. His father repaired tractors for farmers who could barely afford gas, and young Frank spent his childhood covered in oil, tightening bolts and cleaning carburetors. When he wasn't fixing engines, he was racing jalopies down dirt roads, building his first sense of speed, power, and what metal could take before it broke. He used to say, "You don't need blueprints when you can feel how the engine breathes." That instinct, the ability to listen to machinery as if it spoke, was what set him apart from the start. When America entered the war in 1941, O'Malley didn't enlist for glory. He joined because he wanted to fix airplanes. "Every man's got a talent," he told the recruiter. "Mine's making things work when they shouldn't." By 1943, he was stationed at an Allied airfield in southeast England, working with the 56th Fighter Group under Colonel Hub Zemp, an outfit that would soon become legendary as Zemp's Wolfpack. It was a chaotic world. The airfield was a patchwork of mud, tents, and corrugated hangars. Every morning began with the smell of aviation fuel and burnt oil. Mechanics worked 12-hour shifts, sometimes more, in cold, so brutal their hands froze to the tools. But nobody complained much. They were keeping men alive. O'Malley quickly became known as the kind of man who didn't wait for orders. If an engine failed, he tore it apart. If a radio jammed, he rewired it himself. Once, when a flight leader's landing gear jammed mid-descent, O'Malley drove a jeep onto the runway with a blowtorch and freed it manually while the aircraft hovered above. The pilot later said, "That man's got ice where the rest of us have nerves." But O'Malley wasn't fearless. He was furious. Furious at how often men died for stupid reasons. "You can't fight a war with perfect paperwork," he grumbled to another mechanic. "You fight it with spit and steel." He didn't see airplanes as machines. He saw them as living things, each with their own temperament. "Some birds are stubborn," he'd say. "You gotta talk them into flying." When the P-47 Thunderbolt arrived at the base, O'Malley saw a misunderstood beast. The pilots called it too heavy, Too clumsy. The engineers called it operationally sufficient. O'Malley called it unfinished. Every time a Thunderbolt came back from combat, smoking and half dead, O'Malley would crawl beneath it, examining the bullet holes, tracing the heat patterns, sniffing the oil. He could tell from the smell whether the problem was in the fuel mix or the cooling system. Machines leave clues. He told the rookies, "You just have to listen." That obsessive attention to detail earned him the respect of pilots, but not the love of officers. To them, he was a risk. He questioned everything. "Sir," he once said to a captain, inspecting his hangar, "you can follow the manual all you want, but that manual ain't never seen combat." The captain frowned. "Neither have you, Sergeant." O'Malley smiled faintly. "No, sir, but I fixed the planes of the men who have." By late 1943, the Allied campaign over Europe was intensifying. Bombers needed fighter escorts, and the Luftwaffe still ruled the high skies. The 56th Fighter Group was supposed to change that, but their Thunderbolts kept overheating, flaming out, and dying before they could even reach the fight. The brass blamed the pilots blamed the machines. But O'Malley knew the truth. The P-47 wasn't broken. It was strangled by its own design, and he was the only one reckless enough to prove it. By the winter of 1943, frustration was the unofficial language of the 56th Fighter Group. Every sortie seemed to end with at least one P-47 limping home in smoke, or not returning at all. The pilots blamed the mechanics blamed the engineers, and the engineers, thousands of miles away in New York, blamed improper maintenance under combat conditions. The truth was uglier. The Thunderbolt's massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, a marvel on paper, was suffocating in practice. The turbocharger overheated under strain. Oil pooled where it shouldn't. Pilots who climbed too hard saw their temperatures spike into the red, followed by a sickening cough from the engine and silence. Another one's cooked. The ground crews would mutter as they watched yet another fighter glide in dead stick over the field, landing gear scraping sparks across the runway. O'Malley had seen enough. He knew the root problem wasn't the engine. It was the airflow. The ducts feeding the supercharger were too narrow, and the cowling trapped heat like a stove. It was a design built for blueprints, not battle. He had watched Lieutenant Ringo Harrison barely crawl out of his fighter last week after his oil pressure dropped to 0. When O'Malley examined the wreck, he saw the same signs again. Baked metal, blistered wiring, coolant boiling out of the vents. "They're dying of thirst," he told his crew, kicking at a pile of tools. "Engines need to breathe, and this one's choking." One of the mechanics, a nervous kid named Franks, looked up. "But the manual says we can't touch the ducting without a requisition order." O'Malley gave him a long look. "The manual ever watch a man burn to death because his turbo line froze?" That shut him up. The Army Air Forces had a clear rule: no modifications without approval. Every aircraft was property of the government. Unauthorized changes could mean a court-martial. But to O'Malley, rules written by engineers who never left their offices weren't laws. They were obstacles. That night, he went to the hangar long after the lights were out. The place was silent, except for the groan of metal expanding in the cold. He set his coffee thermos on the wing, pulled a wrench from his pocket, and got to work. He removed the front cowling, exposing the monstrous radial engine, a maze of tubes, wires, and bolts. He'd memorized its anatomy from countless repairs, but now he was looking at it like a surgeon about to break every medical code in the book. He widened the intake by cutting through the aluminum with a hacksaw. Then, using salvaged tubing from a wrecked Spitfire, he rerouted the airflow to bypass the heat trap around the supercharger. For good measure, he riveted a crude baffle near the exhaust, something he'd once done on a tractor engine back home. It was brutal. It was ugly. It was completely illegal. When he finished, dawn was breaking. He sat back on the wing, covered in oil and soot, and stared at what he'd made. The once sleek fighter now had an asymmetrical bulge on its side. It looked like a wounded animal, but he didn't care about looks. He cared about performance. The next morning, the airfield was buzzing about O'Malley's stunt. His crew whispered that the sergeant had gone rogue. Even Ringo Harrison, the pilot who'd nearly died last week, thought he'd lost his mind. "Frank," Ringo said, shaking his head, "you know they'll hang you for this, right?" O'Malley grinned. "Maybe, but they'll hang me with a wrench in my hand, not a rulebook." Later that day, the modified P-47 sat gleaming in the winter light. Its engine purred with a sound no one had heard before, smooth, deep, confident. O'Malley took a step back and said quietly, "Let's see if breaking the rules can keep men alive." It would, and within weeks, the skies over Europe would prove it. When O'Malley's commanding officer finally saw what he'd done, the reaction was immediate. "What in God's name did you do to that aircraft?" "Sergeant?" O'Malley stood at attention, wiping the sweat from his forehead. "Improved it, sir. Improved it," the officer barked, walking around the modified P-47 like it was a crime scene. "You butchered government property. You violated Section 42 of the Maintenance Code and half the damned Army Air Force regulations." O'Malley didn't flinch, and I might have saved a few lives while I was at it. The officer opened his mouth to reply, but before he could, the hangar filled with the growl of the Thunderbolt's engine. One of the mechanics had climbed in and hit the starter, the R-2000. 800 roared to life, not the uneven sputter they'd all grown used to, but a deep, steady thunder. The sound filled the space, vibrating through the floor like a living heartbeat. Everyone stopped talking. The gauges were perfect. Oil pressure stable, temperature steady, no overheating. O'Malley's new ducting system was feeding the turbocharger evenly. Even the exhaust shimmer looked cleaner. The officer just stared, unable to hide his surprise. "You're lucky this works, Sergeant. You're still going to have to explain yourself to command." O'Malley nodded. "Yes, sir. But first, let's get it tested where it counts. Up there." That test would come sooner than anyone expected. Lieutenant Ringo Harrison, the hot-headed pilot who had nearly died in one of the old Thunderbolts, volunteered to fly O'Malley's modified aircraft. "If it explodes," he joked grimly, "I'll haunt you." O'Malley smirked. "Deal. Just don't stall her. She's temperamental until she knows you mean business." When Ringo climbed into the cockpit, the rest of the airfield gathered around. The plane looked ridiculous. Its hastily cut cowling and mismatched metal patches made it look like a Frankenstein creation. But when Ringo hit the throttle, the aircraft leapt forward with a power no one expected. The wheels left the ground in half the usual distance. The modified Thunderbolt climbed like a different breed entirely, cutting through the grey English sky with raw aggression. The radio crackled. "Temp steady at 10,000. 15, 20. No overheating." O'Malley's hands clenched into fists as the voice continued. "Jesus, O'Malley, she's smooth. Never flown anything like this." The hangar erupted in cheers. Even the commanding officer couldn't hide his grin. But O'Malley didn't cheer. He just exhaled long and slow. He knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of trouble. Word spread fast. Other mechanics wanted to see his schematics. Pilots started asking if their planes could get the O'Malley mod. The officers, of course, wanted none of it. "Sergeant O'Malley," the major in charge of engineering finally said, "you are not authorized to make changes to combat aircraft." O'Malley just looked him in the eye. 5C, then authorize it, sir," the major frowned. "You think this is a democracy?" O'Malley's voice hardened. "No, sir. I think it's a war." For a week, his future hung by a thread. He kept working quietly, making the same airflow adjustments in secret whenever an aircraft came in for maintenance. He didn't sign off the changes officially. He just made them happen. By the time the brass realized how widespread the modification had become, something else happened. P-47 seconds with O'Malley's fix were performing better in every measurable way. Fewer failures, faster climbs, cooler engines. The Air Force had a problem. It couldn't punish success. A memo from headquarters quietly circulated a month later. Field maintenance modification approved for continued evaluation. That was military code for don't ask who did it, but keep doing it. Frank O'Malley didn't need medals or credit. All he needed was the sound of a Thunderbolt, returning safely to base, engine purring, pilot alive. That sound to him was victory. 2 weeks later, O'Malley's illegal fix faced its baptism of fire. It was March 1944, and the 56th Fighter Group had been assigned escort duty for a daylight raid over Germany. The target: industrial complexes outside Hanover, factories that fed the Nazi war machine with engines, ammunition, and steel. The Luftwaffe had been waiting. As the formation of B-17 seconds climbed past 20,000 feet, the Thunderbolts, some modified, some not, formed up to protect them. Among them was Lieutenant Ringo Harrison, flying the same patched-together P-47 that O'Malley had worked on in defiance of orders. O'Malley stood at the airfield, staring at the horizon as the sound of engines faded into the distance. He knew what they were flying into: flak, fighters, chaos. And he knew that if his fix failed, the blame would fall squarely on him. Hours later, the radio at the command post crackled to life. The first fragments of the battle reached them in bursts of static and half-shouted transmissions. "Bandits 12 high. Messerschmitts everywhere. Red 2's hit. No, he's pulling up. He's climbing. This Thunderbolt's running hot. Wait." Temp dropping back. "She's holding steady." O'Malley froze. That last voice. It was Harrison. For 30 minutes, the airwaves became a chaotic mix of gunfire and prayer. The Luftwaffe had thrown everything it had into the fight. Dozens of FW 190 seconds and BF 109 seconds slashed into the bomber formations, while Thunderbolts dove, rolled, and climbed in response. At one point, Harrison's wingman took a burst of cannon fire and spun out. Harrison rolled inverted, chasing the German fighter that had fired the shot. Normally, the P-47's engine would have overheated in such a sustained climb, but not this one. "Engine's cool, O'Malley," he shouted over the radio. "Cool is the other side of hell." He closed in behind the enemy plane, lined up the shot, and fired a 2-second burst from his 8.50 caliber guns. The German fighter exploded mid-air, a fireball against the cold northern sky. Back at base, the hours crawled. Mechanics smoked nervously. The officers pretended to read reports. O'Malley just sat on a fuel drum, staring at the runway, waiting for the sound. Then he heard it, a low, confident rumble in the distance. One by one, the Thunderbolts began to return. Some were battered, some trailing smoke, but they were alive. When Harrison taxied to a stop, O'Malley was already there, running alongside the wing. The pilot opened the canopy, his face smeared with oil and adrenaline. She flew like she wanted to fight. Harrison yelled, grinning like a madman. "Didn't overheat. Didn't quit. I outclimbed 190 seconds and sent one home in flames." O'Malley just nodded, unable to speak. For the first time in months, his hands weren't shaking from rage. They were shaking from relief. The after-action report confirmed it. Every P-47, with O'Malley's modification, returned safely. 2 of the unmodified Thunderbolts had been lost to engine failure during the same mission. The difference was undeniable. When the results reached the top brass, they didn't bother sending congratulations. They sent an order. All field modifications approved for immediate standardization across the 8th Air Force. That meant O'Malley's illegal fix had just become official doctrine. In the following weeks, bomber crews started noticing something strange. The Thunderbolts protecting them weren't falling out of formation anymore. They were faster, more aggressive, more reliable. The German pilots noticed it too. Reports from Luftwaffe intelligence described the P-47 seconds as demonstrating abnormal endurance and cooling efficiency. O'Malley didn't need a medal. The proof was in every pilot who came home alive. That night after the mission, the mechanics threw together a celebration in the hangar. Cheap beer, bad music, laughter echoing through the cold English night. Harrison raised a bottle to him. "Frank," he said, "you didn't just fix a plane, you fixed the odds." O'Malley took the bottle, but didn't drink. He just smiled faintly. "All I did was let her breathe." By April 1944, the results of O'Malley's modification were impossible to ignore. P-47 squadrons, fitted with his airflow redesign, were outperforming every other group in the European theater. The data spoke for itself. Lower failure rates, higher sortie completion, and longer flight endurance. Pilots were returning from deep strikes over enemy territory, still with power to spare. But victory has a way of attracting attention and scrutiny. One grey morning, O'Malley was summoned to headquarters. He walked into a small room with olive walls and a single wooden desk. 3 officers sat waiting, their faces blank, their folders thick with paperwork. "Sergeant O'Malley," the colonel began. "We've reviewed your maintenance reports, or rather, the lack of them. You've made unauthorized alterations to multiple government aircraft. Do you deny this?" O'Malley stood at parade rest, meeting the colonel's eyes. "No, sir, I don't deny it." "Then you understand the seriousness of what you've done?" "Yes, sir. But I also understand that those planes are coming back with pilots still breathing." A tense silence filled the room. Finally, the colonel leaned back. "You realize this kind of initiative, while admirable in results, can't be encouraged officially. It sets a precedent. We can't have every mechanic improvising on million-dollar equipment." O'Malley didn't answer. They all knew the truth. His improvisation had saved dozens of aircraft and lives. The colonel sighed. "You'll receive a formal reprimand in your file, but off the record." He paused, a small smirk crossing his face. "Good work, Sergeant. Keep saving our boys." It wasn't recognition, but it was permission. That night, O'Malley returned to the hangar, exhausted, but smiling. The men were waiting for him, anxious for news. "They court-martialed you?" Franks asked. O'Malley shook his head. "Not yet. They just told me to stop doing what I'm doing." "So, you're stopping?" another mechanic asked. O'Malley grinned. "Didn't say that either." The men laughed. For the first time, the hangar felt alive, like a place where they were making history, not just repairs. In the following months, O'Malley continued refining the modification, this time with quiet support from command. The Air Force never officially credited him, but field manuals began to include his airflow adjustments under recommended field adaptations. It was bureaucracy's way of saying, "We need this, but we'll never admit it came from a sergeant." Then came the letter. It arrived from the United States, sealed and marked confidential. It wasn't from the Army. It was from Pratt & Whitney, the engine manufacturer. Someone at headquarters had passed O'Malley's design to them. The letter thanked him for field insights that improved operational reliability of the R2800 series. It even included a check for $200 and a signed note from one of the chief engineers. Sometimes the best engineers wear grease, not ties. O'Malley folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his jacket pocket. He never cashed the check. By summer 1944, the O'Malley fix, as pilots jokingly called it, had become standard across most Thunderbolt units. The results were staggering. Mission success rates climbed and combat losses from mechanical failure plummeted. Word reached even higher. A general visiting the base asked one of the group commanders, "Who the hell figured this out?" The commander shrugged. "Just some sergeant who didn't like reading manuals." The general laughed. "Good. Maybe we need more of those." O'Malley never heard about it. He was too busy under the hood of another aircraft, sleeves rolled up, face streaked with oil, humming to himself as engines roared outside. To him, the war wasn't about glory. It was about work done right, even when no one was watching. And as long as those Thunderbolts kept flying, that was all the recognition he needed. By the end of 1944, O'Malley's reputation had spread far beyond his own airfield. Pilots across England were talking about the junk plane that outflew the Luftwaffe. Mechanics from other squadrons started writing to him for instructions. Most of them didn't even know his name. They just called him the guy who made the P-47 breathe again. But to those who served alongside him, the legend wasn't about the machine. It was about the moment that one man decided to stop following the book and start following logic. One freezing December morning, O'Malley's fix met its ultimate test. A massive bombing run was planned over the Ardennes right as Hitler launched his surprise counterattack. The weather was brutal, the air thick with flak and cloud, and every pilot who climbed into a cockpit knew it could be their last mission. O'Malley worked through the night, tuning engines in the glow of flickering lamps. He could barely feel his fingers. When one of the pilots, a young man from Kansas, barely 20 years old, came to check on his aircraft, O'Malley looked up and said, "She'll bring you home." The pilot smiled. "You sound sure." O'Malley tightened a final bolt. "I don't gamble." At dawn, the air shook with the roar of hundreds of Thunderbolts taking off in formation. O'Malley stood on the runway, hat pulled low, watching them disappear into the grey horizon. The mission was chaos. German fighters pounced on the bombers the moment they crossed the front. The radio network crackled with shouts, bursts of static, and sudden silence. "Bandits at 5. Engine hit. I'm losing oil pressure." "Wait. Stabilizing. She's still running. O'Malley, you genius. She's still running." Hours later, the first planes returned, battered, scorched, but alive. The young pilot from Kansas taxied to a stop, canopy open, smoke pouring from the wings. He jumped down, tears streaming down his face, and hugged O'Malley before anyone could stop him. "She took a hit in the manifold. Any other bird would have blown apart, but yours, she just kept flying." O'Malley just smiled and said, "Told you I don't gamble." That night, Command confirmed the results. Every P-47 modified under O'Malley's design made it home that day. None had suffered catastrophic engine failure. For a moment, amidst a war that devoured lives by the thousands, a handful of men had beaten the odds because one mechanic refused to follow orders. In the weeks that followed, pilots started marking their aircraft with a small symbol, a crude wrench painted beneath the cockpit. It wasn't official. It wasn't even regulation, but among Thunderbolt crews, it meant something simple. This plane's been touched by O'Malley's hands. Even the higher-ups noticed. A visiting general inspecting the base asked about the strange markings. When a pilot explained the story, the general simply said, "Keep him in the hangar then. He's worth a squadron." As the war neared its end, O'Malley was offered a transfer to an engineering division in London. It was the kind of promotion most enlisted men dreamed of. Offices, clean uniforms, no more freezing nights on the tarmac. He turned it down. "They've got plenty of officers in London," he told his commanding officer. "What they don't have are enough mechanics who care." When the war finally ended, the 56th Fighter Group gathered for one last formation flight. As the Thunderbolts roared overhead in perfect symmetry, O'Malley stood alone by the runway, head tilted back, listening. To everyone else, it was just the sound of engines. To him, it was the sound of everything he'd worked for. Proof that machines could have souls, that rules could bend for the right reasons, and that one act of defiance could change the course of war. He reached into his pocket and unfolded the grease-stained note that Harrison had given him after the last mission. It said in shaky handwriting, "We flew higher because you broke the rules." O'Malley folded it again, slipped it into his jacket, and smiled. The junk plane had become a legend, and so had the man who fixed it. When peace finally came in 1945, the airfields of England began to fall silent. The once roaring runways that had sent men into the sky daily now echoed only with the clatter of tools being packed away. Mechanics dismantled tents, pilots signed transfer papers, and O'Malley found himself standing in front of the same hangar door where it had all begun. For the first time in years, he didn't have a plane to fix. The squadron commander approached him one afternoon with discharge papers and a single sentence. "You've done your duty, Sergeant. Time to go home." O'Malley looked around. The empty hangar, the fading oil stains on the concrete, the faint smell of fuel in the air. This was the only world he'd known since before Pearl Harbor. "Home," he muttered quietly. "Guess I forgot what that looks like." He took a train back across England, then a ship back across the Atlantic. The journey home was strangely quiet. No engines to tune, no missions to prep, just endless water and the uneasy stillness that comes after years of noise. When he finally arrived in New Jersey, he was met not by a crowd, but by the hum of a rebuilding nation. Factories that had built engines for war were now churning out cars and tractors. The same assembly lines that had fed his beloved Thunderbolts were giving birth to a new kind of American future. One day he received a letter from a name he hadn't heard in months. Major Robert "Cowboy" Harrison, now back in Texas. The letter was short, written in Harrison's blunt style. "O'Malley, they're talking about putting your fix in the post-war P-47 manual. Said it improved airflow efficiency by 7%. The boys are saying you saved more pilots than half the generals combined. Thought you'd want to know." O'Malley laughed when he read it, not because of the compliment, but because the official Army Air Force's technical bulletin now included the exact airflow modification that had once been labeled unauthorized. The very line in the manual that condemned him during the war now carried his idea as standard procedure. It read, "In field conditions, mechanics are authorized to apply adaptive cowling baffles and modified oil cooler ducting per field experience reports." It didn't say his name, but everyone who knew the story would recognize who field experience meant. After the war, O'Malley worked briefly at a civilian aircraft company in Ohio. They offered him a comfortable office job, but he turned it down after 2 weeks. "I belong near engines," he told the foreman. He ended up back on the shop floor, working beside grease-stained men with the same calloused hands he'd known in England. Every so often, new recruits would gather around him to hear stories of the war. One young mechanic asked, "Sergeant, is it true you broke regulations to save those planes?" O'Malley smiled. "Kid, I didn't break them. I just read between the lines." He never married, never chased fame, but every year, veterans from his old squadron sent him Christmas cards, each one with a small symbol drawn at the bottom, a wrench beneath a pair of wings. By the early 1952, his modification had influenced the design of new jet engine cooling systems. Aviation engineers cited field-tested adaptations from wartime mechanics in their research papers. Again, no name, just quiet legacy. O'Malley didn't mind. He never cared about credit, only results. One evening, sitting on his porch, he heard the distant rumble of a jet passing overhead. It was sleek, silver, and fast, a far cry from the old Thunderbolt. But as it disappeared into the clouds, O'Malley smiled to himself. "Different engine," he whispered. "Same principle." He took a sip of his coffee, looked at the sky, and said softly, "If she flies, I did my part." And somewhere in a museum in England, a restored P-47 Thunderbolt bears a small engraving on its engine cowling, dedicated to the unnamed mechanic who made her breathe again. Decades later, long after the roar of piston engines had faded from the skies, a group of aviation historians gathered at an air museum in Duxford, England. They were restoring an original P-47 Thunderbolt, one that had flown missions over Europe in 1944. Its paint was faded, its wings patched, but its heart, the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800, was still intact. During the restoration, one of the volunteers found something unexpected inside the cowling, a small piece of aluminum etched with barely visible letters beneath layers of grime. It read simply, "Keep her breathing, O'Malley." Nobody could say how it got there. There was no official record, no document, no name in any archive, but the mechanics who found it fell silent for a long moment. They knew they were looking at a ghost signature, a whisper from the man who defied orders to save lives. One of the volunteers, a retired engineer, said softly, "Whoever he was, he understood airplanes better than the Rulebook ever could." That single piece of metal became the centerpiece of the exhibit, labeled Field Mechanics, Note, Origin Unknown. Visitors stared at it, wondering about the nameless man who'd written it in the middle of war. Back in the United States, O'Malley had passed away quietly years before. No medals, no headlines. His death certificate listed his occupation simply as aircraft mechanic. But among the pilots of the 56th Fighter Group, his name lived on in the stories told at reunions. Major Harrison, older now, walking with a cane, would always raise his glass and say, "To O'Malley, the man who made the Thunderbolt breathe fire." And every veteran in the room would nod, remembering the man who didn't follow rules, but followed results. By the 1970s, aviation had entered the jet age. Computers replaced wrenches, and pilots relied more on systems than instincts. But deep in the manuals, the spirit of O'Malley's defiance remained. The principle that if something doesn't work, fix it. Even if no one's given you permission. It became the quiet creed of every good mechanic. Don't ask if it's allowed. Ask if it'll fly. A young Air Force cadet once stumbled across an old article describing a wartime field modification that saved dozens of P-47 seconds. He brought it to his instructor and asked, "Sir, do you think it's true?" The instructor smiled. "Every war has its O'Malley, the kind of man who bends the rules so others can live. That's how progress works, by people who care more about results than regulations." Somewhere that would have made O'Malley grin. In 1989, The Smithsonian Air and Space Museum opened a new exhibit on the evolution of aircraft maintenance during World War II. Buried among the photos and charts was a single black and white picture, grainy, candid, and powerful. It showed a young mechanic standing knee-deep in mud beside a Thunderbolt, sleeves rolled, hands on a wrench, a cigarette clamped between his teeth. The caption read, "Unidentified U.S. Army Air Forces mechanic, England, 1944. Field modifications like his kept American air power flying strong. No name, no rank, but that's how O'Malley would have wanted it. Because his story wasn't about fame, it was about function. About the courage to see a broken system and make it better, even if the manual said not to. That was the unwritten rule of every man who worked beneath the wings of history. Engines may roar, pilots may soar, but it's the hands in the shadows that keep them both alive." As the museum lights dimmed that evening, the sound of a restored R-2800 engine filled the air, its deep growl shaking the glass walls. The visitors turned their heads toward the sound. For a moment, time folded back, and they could almost see him there again. Sergeant O'Malley wiping his hands on a rag, squinting at the horizon as another pilot took off in a machine he'd made unkillable. And if you listened closely through the roar, you could almost hear his voice, calm and certain, carried by the echo of propellers. "Just keep her breathing.